Hey everyone, and welcome back.
Today we're diving into something really fascinating.
Okay.
The foundations of U.S. government.
You want to know where the ideas came from?
Right.
How they made it into the Constitution?
And why any of it should matter to you in the 21st century?
Yeah.
We've got you covered.
We dug into historical documents, expert analyses,
Okay.
even unearthed some surprising visuals to bring it all to life.
That's great.
What's so cool about this is that when we think of history,
Yeah.
we often think of big events or famous people.
Right.
But ideas have a history too.
A story that stretches back centuries.
And those ideas,
Yeah.
they can be just as powerful as any ruler or revolution.
So we're not just talking about memorizing dates and names.
No.
It's more like we're tracing the DNA of democracy.
Precisely. To understand the U.S. government,
You have to meet its intellectual ancestors.
and for that,
We need to take a trip back to ancient Greece and Rome.
time travel it is.
No togas required, though, right?
Thankfully not.
But those ancient civilizations,
They weren't just about togas and chariots.
they were experimenting with democracy thousands of years ago.
And some of those ideas, they're still with us today.
That's wild.
So, paint a picture for me.
Okay.
Let's say I'm a merchant in ancient Athens.
Selling my wares in the shadow of the Acropolis.
What's life like, government-wise?
Well, you wouldn't just be a silent observer.
You'd actually have a direct say in how your city was run.
Okay.
This was the power of the polis.
A self-governing city-state that thrived on civic participation.
Athens was like a giant town hall meeting,
Uh-huh.
except instead of arguing about potholes,
They were debating laws and policies,
they even had this amazing thing called the assembly.
where any citizen could voice their opinions and vote.
Wow, so it was real direct democracy way back then.
Did it work?
It was groundbreaking for its time.
But Athenian democracy wasn't perfect.
It was a democracy for the few, not the many.
Women and slaves were completely excluded from participating.
A sobering reminder that the fight for inclusive democracy is an ongoing journey.
That's a really important point.
So how does ancient Rome fit into all of this?
They started with a king too, right?
They did, but they learned pretty quickly.
That concentrating power in one person wasn't always the best idea.
Okay.
They eventually kicked out the king.
And established a republic.
A system where citizens elect representatives to make decisions on their behalf.
Sound familiar?
It should. That's the system we have here in the U.S.
We elect our senators, our representatives.
It's like ancient Rome is echoed in our modern elections.
It really is. But the Romans gave us more than just the concept of a republic.
They also championed the rule of law,
This idea that everyone
from the emperor wearing purple to the chariot racer covered in dust.
is subject to the same laws.
That's a pretty radical concept, even today.
It is.
No cutting in line for the Colosseum just because you're related to the emperor.
That's a relief.
Exactly.
And alongside the rule of law,
The Romans championed something else. We hold dear separation of powers.
remember, they learned their lesson about putting all their eggs in one basket.
Or all their power in one person.
Right.
So they divided the government into different branches.
Each with its own powers.
Uh-huh.
And this is key, the ability to check the other branches.
Checks and balances, baby.
They were masters of limiting power.
Long before Hamilton and Madison were even born.
They were.
And when you look at this diagram,
It's incredible how these ancient ideas
these Roman principles,
were directly reflected in the U.S. Constitution.
we'll get into that more later.
But it's amazing to see this direct lineage.
This intellectual DNA being passed down through the centuries.
Okay, so we've got these ancient Greeks and Romans laying the groundwork for democracy. But something tells me there's more to the story.
You're right. The foundation needs more than just columns and arches.
It needs something to hold it all together.
And for the founding fathers, a lot of that came from the Judeo-Christian tradition.
That's interesting.
We often think of the U.S. government as being secular.
So how did these ancient religious ideas make their way into the mix?
It's a fascinating blend of influences.
Think about the Ten Commandments.
They might be religious in origin, but they express some pretty fundamental concepts about justice that any society needs.
Don't steal, don't kill, don't lie.
These ideas resonated with the founders, even if they weren't always quoting scripture.
So it's like the Ten Commandments, regardless of where they came from, provided a framework for thinking about laws and morality.
Exactly.
It's about those core values.
And beyond those specific rules, the Judeo-Christian tradition emphasizes the inherent value of every person, the idea that we're all created equal in the eyes of a higher power.
This belief had a huge impact on how the founders viewed individual rights.
even if it wasn't explicitly written into the Constitution.
That's a great point. You don't see God mentioned directly in the Constitution, do you?
You don't.
But that core value, the inherent worth of every individual, it's woven into the fabric of the document.
It's the foundation for those essential freedoms that we cherish today.
So even with the separation of church and state, these religious values were still influencing the architects of our government.
Absolutely.
And it goes beyond just individual rights.
Think about the concept of personal responsibility.
The Judeo-Christian tradition emphasizes being accountable for your actions.
That makes me think of the phrase, with great power comes great responsibility.
Like, the founders were giving us these incredible freedoms, but also reminding us that we have a duty to use them wisely.
That's a great way to put it.
It's a two-way street. Freedom to choose, but also responsibility for those choices.
That balance is central to the American experiment.
Okay, so we've got the columns of Greece and Rome, the mortar of Judeo-Christian values.
But what about the blueprints?
What were those key documents that directly influenced the founders as they sat down to create this new government?
Ah, yes, the blueprints.
We need to talk about the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, the English Bill of Rights.
Each one of these documents is like a piece of the puzzle that is the U.S. Constitution.
Let's break it down.
First up, the Magna Carta.
It's from like the 1200s, right?
Why should we care about something that old?
The Magna Carta is fascinating because it established a radical principle for its time.
Even the king is bound by the law.
This idea of limiting the power of the ruler, it was huge.
It was a major step toward the kind of limited government that the U.S. would eventually embrace.
So it's not just some dusty old document signed by a king who probably had terrible hygiene.
It's about this idea that no one is above the law.
Exactly.
The Magna Carta planted the seed for a system based on the rule of law, not on the whims of a monarch.
Okay, that's pretty huge.
Next up, the Mayflower Compact.
I have to admit, the name makes it sound more like a self-storage agreement than a founding document.
Right.
But trust me, this one's important.
The Mayflower Compact was created by the Pilgrims before they even set foot in Plymouth.
It was an agreement, a covenant, about how they would govern themselves in this new land.
So they were basically like, hey, we're all in this together, floating across the ocean on this rickety ship.
Let's make some rules so we don't descend into chaos.
Exactly.
And the key concept here is consent of the governed.
The Mayflower Compact demonstrated that a legitimate government gets its power from the agreement of the people it governs.
Wait a minute. That ties directly back to we the people? It's like they were pre-gaming the Constitution.
They were way ahead of their time.
The Mayflower Compact, even though it was created for a small colony, enshrined a principle that would become fundamental to the American system.
That's amazing. Okay, last but not least, we have the English Bill of Rights.
This one feels a little closer to home, name-wise at least.
It is.
The English Bill of Rights, passed in 1689, built on the ideas of the Magna Carta, limiting the monarchy even further and guaranteeing certain rights to English citizens.
Okay, give me some examples. What kind of rights are we talking about?
Well, some big ones were freedom of speech, protection from cruel and unusual punishment, and the right to petition the government.
Sound familiar?
They should. Those are all enshrined in the U.S. Bill of Rights.
It's like we inherited them directly from England.
We did.
The English Bill of Rights was a direct influence on the founders.
They believed these rights apply to them as English subjects.
Even across the Atlantic.
And when King George III started acting like those rights didn't matter, well, let's just say they weren't too thrilled about it.
Yeah, I can see how that would lead to some tension across the pond.
Speaking of tension, wasn't there a very important pamphlet going around about this time?
You're thinking of Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
That's the one. It always felt like required reading in history class.
Well, it was revolutionary.
Published in 1776, Paine's pamphlet was a game changer.
It argued, in very clear language that everyone could understand, that the monarchy was a bad idea.
That it was common sense for the American colonies to declare their independence.
So he was basically like, hey, everyone, this whole king thing, it's kind of a raw deal. We can do better.
Exactly.
And his words resonated with the colonists.
Paine's pamphlet, more than any other document, helped turn public opinion toward independence.
Wow.
So we've gone from ancient Greece and Rome to the signing of the Magna Carta, the Mayflower Compact, the English Bill of Rights, and finally, Thomas Paine's call for independence.
It's like this incredible chain reaction of ideas all leading to the American Revolution.
Just amazing, isn't it?
All these documents, these thinkers, they laid the intellectual and philosophical groundwork for the United States.
But as you know, declaring independence is one thing, actually building a functioning government from scratch.
Well, that's a whole other challenge.
That's where the Constitution comes in, right? But we can't forget about the Articles of Confederation.
Spoiler alert, it didn't go so well.
You're right.
It's important to remember that the Constitution wasn't America's first attempt at self-governance.
They tried the Articles of Confederation first, and, well, let's just say it was a bit of a learning experience.
Okay, so what went wrong?
Why were the Articles such a disaster?
The biggest problem was that they created a very weak central government.
They gave most of the power to the states, which sounds great in theory, but in practice, it made it almost impossible to get anything done on a national level.
So it was like 13 different countries, all trying to share one flag.
Basically.
And as you can imagine, that didn't exactly create a stable or prosperous nation.
They were so focused on preventing tyranny that they accidentally invented anarchy.
So they tried to create a government so weak it couldn't hurt anyone.
Right.
And they ended up with one that couldn't help anyone either.
Pretty much.
Which brings us to why a bunch of farmers waving pitchforks had something to do with ditching the Articles of Confederation entirely.
Yes, Shays' Rebellion.
Talk about your wake-up calls.
Right. This wasn't just a protest.
It was a full-blown uprising that exposed just how weak the Articles really were.
Uh-huh.
The government couldn't even put down a rebellion.
Whoa.
Can you imagine?
No.
It was a moment of reckoning.
A sign that they needed a complete system upgrade.
Cue the montage of guys in powdered wigs having an existential crisis.
Enter the Constitutional Convention of 1787.
Did they know they were about to create something so monumental?
It's funny.
They thought they were just there for some light editing.
A little tune-up to the Articles.
Yeah.
But they quickly realized they weren't dealing with a typo.
They were dealing with a fundamental design flaw.
And that, my friends, is where the real debate began.
Federalists versus anti-federalists. Talk about a historical clash of titans.
Right.
It was like watching the political version of Ali Frazier.
It really was an epic showdown.
And we're lucky enough to have some amazing sources that captured those different viewpoints.
On one side, you had folks like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison,
Arguing for a strong central government,
Right.
one that could actually enforce laws and keep the country from falling apart.
Makes sense, given how the whole Articles Confederation thing worked out.
Right, but then on the other side, you had the anti-federalists.
Folks like Patrick Henry and George Mason,
Okay.
who were like,
Yeah.
whoa, hold on a minute.
Didn't we just fight a revolution to get away from a powerful central government? We need safeguards. We need a Bill of Rights.
Talk about a difference of opinion.
So how did they ever manage to bridge that massive divide? It seems like a recipe for a stalemate.
Compromise, my friend, compromise.
And one of the biggest compromises, the one that really saved the day, was the Great Compromise.
I've heard of this.
Something about representation in Congress, right?
That's the one.
See, they were trying to figure out how states should be represented in Congress.
Should it be based on population,
Uh-huh.
which would give more power to the larger states?
Or should every state get an equal say, regardless of size?
Yeah, that sounds like it could have gone south pretty quickly.
So what was the solution? How did they manage to come together?
They created a bicameral legislature.
2 houses of Congress, a Senate where each state gets 2 senators,
Which made the smaller states happy,
equal representation,
and a House of Representatives.
where representation is based on each state's population,
Like,
which ensured the larger states had a proportionally bigger voice.
pretty genius, right?
It's brilliant.
They managed to create a system that balanced the interests of both the big and small states.
Making sure everyone felt heard. It's
Yep.
like the ultimate political power sharing agreement.
It really is.
And, out of all that debating, all that compromising, emerged this incredible document we call the U.S. Constitution.
And get this,
It's still going strong after all these years.
it's a testament to how well crafted it was.
And it all goes back to those foundational principles we've been talking about.
That iconic first line of the preamble, "We the people."
It still gives me chills every time I hear it.
Me too. It's such a powerful statement.
It's not we the states or we the government, but we the people.
It establishes right then and there that the very foundation of the United States is this beautiful idea of popular sovereignty.
That the government gets its power from the consent of the governed. It's a direct echo of those ancient Greek ideas of civic participation we talked about earlier.
It's incredible how those ideas transcend time and place.
It really is.
And then, of course, there's that whole separation of powers thing.
Right.
Legislative, executive, judicial branches.
They built in those safeguards to make sure no one person or group could amass too much power and become a tyrant.
Uh-huh.
They were definitely not going to repeat the mistakes of the monarchy.
And they didn't stop there.
Remember how adamant the Anti-Federalists were about a Bill of Rights?
Oh, they were relentless.
And you know what? They got their wish.
Those first 10 amendments guarantee those essential rights and freedoms,
Right.
ensuring the government doesn't overstep its bounds.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the right to a fair trial. These are rights we often take for granted today.
Exactly. But those rights were hard-won victories.
Shaped by centuries of struggle and debate.
It's mind-blowing to think about, really.
We've gone from ancient Greece to the signing of the Constitution, from togas to town halls.
And the conversation continues.
What started centuries ago is still shaping the world we live in today.
And that's the beauty of it, isn't it?
These aren't just dusty old ideas. They're living, breathing principles that require our constant engagement.
Right.
And that's why you, listening right now, should care.
Because this isn't just history.
It's about how we function as a society, how we protect our rights, how we ensure the government serves the people, and not the other way around.
Okay, so what does this all mean?
What's the takeaway for someone listening to this deep dive?
Someone who wants to be an engaged citizen.
The takeaway is this. The U.S. government,
with all its complexities and challenges, is built on a foundation of ideas that have been debated and refined for centuries.
right,
Understanding those ideas.
where they came from and why they matter is essential to being an informed and engaged citizen.
So it's not just about memorizing dates and names for a history test.
Exactly.
It's about really grasping those core principles.
Those enduring values that continue to shape our world today.
It's about recognizing that this system
This grand experiment in self-governance.
requires our active participation.
Okay.
It's not a spectator sport.
It's about realizing that our democracy is an ongoing conversation.
A constant work in progress.
Yeah.
And it's up to all of us to keep that conversation going.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
We've been talking about these big ideas.
These historical influences.
But what does it actually look like to be an engaged citizen in today's world?
That's the million-dollar question.
And the answer is, there are so many ways to participate in democracy.
It's not just about voting.
Although that is incredibly important.
Yeah.
It's about staying informed, being aware of the issues, engaging in civil discourse,
Right.
even just talking to your friends and family about the things that matter to you.
So we're not just talking about running for office or becoming a political activist.
It can be as simple as being an informed and active member of your community.
Precisely.
Whether it's attending a town hall meeting, volunteering for a local organization, or simply having thoughtful conversations about the challenges we face as a society.
Every active engagement contributes to the health and vibrancy of our democracy.
That makes a lot of sense.
It's like those ancient Greeks gathering in the assembly.
But instead of debating laws, we're trying to figure out how to make our schools better, improve our local parks, or support those in need.
Exactly.
It's about taking ownership of our democracy.
Recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping its future.
That's such a powerful message.
So as we wrap up this incredible deep dive into the foundations of U.S. government,
What's the one thing you want our listener to walk away with today?
I want them to walk away with a sense of hope and empowerment.
Yes, there are challenges.
Yes, there are disagreements,
Right.
but that's part of what makes democracy so dynamic and ultimately so resilient.
It's a system designed for debate.
For compromise, for constant evolution.
And the U.S. system, with all its checks and balances, its emphasis on individual rights, its commitment to popular sovereignty,
Is a testament to the potential of that system.
it's an incredible legacy from those who came before us.
Those who dared to imagine a better way to govern, a better way to live.
They gave us the blueprint
But it's up to us to keep building.
to keep striving for that more perfect union.
Ah, so well said.
It's an incredible inheritance we've been given.
This democracy of ours,
Don't take it for granted,
nurture it, engage with it.
and help it grow stronger for generations to come.
That's a wrap on this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible journey through history and ideas.
It was my pleasure.
And to you, listening,
Yeah,
thank you for being curious.
for engaging with these big ideas.
Remember, an informed citizen is a powerful citizen.
We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the ideas that shape our world.